I would first like to begin opening this space by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm on, which is the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge the lands and the people of the lands that you're dialing in from. I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging, as well as elders and any First Nations peoples who may be present here today. I acknowledge and pay respect to the deep knowledge embedded within the Aboriginal community, their long and continuing relationship with the land, as well as their ownership of country. I'd like to acknowledge that these are stolen lands and that sovereignty has never been ceded. Today, we're honored to have the seminar titled Exercising Jurisdiction, Ethical Research in Aboriginal Communities. That is presented by Jacqui Katona, a Djok woman from the Kakadu area of the Northern Territory, who is an Aboriginal advocate. She has worked for the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, the Stolen Generations Northern Territory, and assisted her family to prevent uranium mining at Jabiluka in Kakadu National Park. With Yvonne Margarula of the Mirrar, she shares the Goldman Environmental Prize of Grassroots Activism in the category Island Nations in 1999. She completed her graduate law degree at the University of Melbourne and is a PhD candidate at the University of Technology, Sydney. She also works as a lecturer researcher at Moondani Balluk Academic Institute, located at Victoria University. The presentation today will examine the imposition of uranium mining in the Kakadu region that brought with it substantial and long-lasting jurisdiction changes. It wasn't the act of mining alone which brought about the extinguishment of Mirrar rights, but the associate development of township of Jabiluka and its administrative arrangements, including the establishment of the newly declared Kakadu National Park. These new entities left Aboriginal people of the region largely ignored in the implementation of additional government and industry agencies with complex political and legislative powers. This presentation shares research that interrogates the authority of the Mirrar to address an overwhelmingly external bureaucratic and policy agenda on the land which they claim successfully and held as inalienable freehold title. In this presentation, Jacqui draws on this work to explore perspectives on ethical research in Aboriginal communities. On that note, I pass on the floor to Jacqui to tell us about her incredible work, and also there will be some time for questions at the end. Jacqui?
Thank you. Thanks so much, Angela. My gosh, what an introduction. Thanks to Chris and Roshani and the Sidran team for hosting my modest seminar today. I, in conversation with Chris one day, was discussing the ethical challenges of PhD research, and he generously suggested that I might have something to share, and I hope you find today's discussion informative and valuable. I'll just share my screen because I'll be using a PowerPoint presentation for today's discussion. I am a lecturer researcher here at Moondani Balluk, which is part of Victoria University, and we deliver a range of subjects in what is commonly known as Indigenous studies. Our senior academic, Professor Gary Foley, and our director, Karen Jackson, are our leaders in this space in Victoria University. And I work with a great team, a fabulous team with tremendous experience, not just in teaching, but also working, exploring the ability that Aboriginal communities have to exercise our agency as Aboriginal people. So I too want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the country that we meet on, because my struggle's intertwined with those traditional owners also. Lands still unanswered in terms of justice for Aboriginal people and reconciliation of historical wrongs. which Aboriginal people continue to manage the impacts of. And today might give you an insight into how colonisation is indelibly part of the interaction between Aboriginal people and every part of the broader Australian community. Unfortunately, Aboriginal communities don't escape the impacts of colonisation because those effects are ongoing. So you heard a bit of a background about me very kindly from Angela. I feel like I've been around for too long. I'm past my use-by date. But my career, very fortunately, has given me a chance to work with Aboriginal communities at a local level on issues of regional importance in Aboriginal communities and of national importance. And I'll reflect on some of those during the presentation. I must admit, a latecomer to academic study. It's just in the last 10 years, but it's been a very busy 10 years. I gained my qualifications as in a Bachelor of Arts at Macquarie University in Sydney in human geography, mainly because I'd done so much work which was really at home, if you like, in that field. I went on, as Angela pointed out, to complete my graduate law degree with the University of Melbourne because the language of legal and political concepts is one that Aboriginal people need to deploy in our struggle, not only for recognition of rights, but the ability to exercise those rights. And I never thought I'd engage in PhD study. And I must admit, I was very reluctant to engage with researchers in the past. So this is very much a learning exercise for me as a PhD student. And it's a learning exercise that I think is really valuable. So I'm quite enthusiastic about it. I began well, if you can call it a career, working at the Australian Institute for Aboriginal Studies. That was the name it was known by when I was working there in the early 1980s. But it really was an opportunity for me to understand how research about Aboriginal people was undertaken. I was in training as an editor of publications, so I engaged frequently with academics who were undertaking research in Aboriginal communities. The Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies, or IATSIS, as it is now known, has a very checkered past with its relationship with the Aboriginal community. Prior to its establishment, research was conducted in university departments of anthropology. Ethnographic research was undertaken. It contributed to global knowledge, but global knowledge which was positioned from a very clear standpoint that was one of documenting difference between what was termed, now debunked, between races of people. And the underpinning of this type of research was the now discredited science of eugenics, but it overall contributed to a discourse of racial hierarchy. This is the reason why we have a preoccupation with power and law, because the outcomes of defining racial hierarchy has determined which parts of our community are powerful and which parts of our community are powerless. These are persistent and incredibly powerful ideas that still motivate policymakers, lawmakers, even discussion at kitchen tables today. It pervades our society. And my aim, I suppose, in my teaching is really to impart the harms of this now discredited science to my students, so that they are better able to identify the source of these destructive and undermining ideas. Because without changing the ideas that were originally produced as a result of academic research, we will forever be trapped in this cage of racial hierarchy. So we now know that these had highly influential power over the policy that the Australian government developed. They had followed through from colonial government legislation to create state-based laws. The primary focus of those state-based laws from the time of Federation was to segregate Aboriginal people from the Australian population and to exploit them as a labour force. Academic research provided the justification, because in the process of studying the anatomy of Aboriginal people, the measurement of skulls, the understanding of social and anatomical development of Aboriginal people was all used to justify Aboriginal people being a subhuman group, and therefore whose exploitation was justified. Even though these theories of race, debunked in the 1960s and widely embraced in international organisations as no longer applicable, now we see cultural difference used as ways to justify harmful behaviour or behaviour that brings about loss for the people who it impacts the most. Of course, we can't ever forget that Aboriginal people still pursue the large collections that are held in international institutions to retrieve those remains which were used to establish these academic truths or so-called truths. So the Australian government policy, this determined the lives of Aboriginal people. These laws were administered in some places notoriously, like the Northern Territory and Western Australia, with the aim of breeding out the colour. These are elements of genocide to which academic research has contributed. These had very real outcomes for Aboriginal people. The two protectors, notorious for their commitment to these genocidal practices, Dr. Cecil Cook in the Northern Territory and A.O. Neville in Western Australia, were special positions created by each state to administer legislation controlling every aspect of Aboriginal lives. Aboriginal people, even where they did earn money, could only have those funds held in trust on their behalf. For example, they had to apply to the protector to buy clothes. And A.O. Neville was notorious for his rejection of these requests from Aboriginal people. Aboriginal people whose children had been removed could write to these protectors to apply for the return of those children. In many cases, it was another refusal because the protector saw his job as necessary to break down any cultural connection, once again, supported by the outcomes of academic research. Another giant in the academic field of anthropology, A.P. Elkin, who for many years conducted research and taught at the University of Sydney, coined the term intelligent parasitism. In his view, this was the only or the most complex engagement that Aboriginal people could participate in when they were dealing with non-Aboriginal people. He took the example of stockmen, Aboriginal stockmen, whose labour was exploited across the country in the establishment of cattle stations in particular. He observed the work of those stockmen and their interactions with the non-Aboriginal family for whom they worked. The non-Aboriginal family was subsidised by the state to provide rations to those Aboriginal people, and they basically worked for flour, sugar, tea, and an issue of clothes annually. A.P. Elkin, in observing these interactions, ascribed a particular behaviour to those Aboriginal people, that they had become parasites on their employers and that they would only engage in an exchange with their employers to gain access to those rations. This made those actions of government policy invisible. It rendered the power relationship between Aboriginal people and their employers as invisible, because there was no scientific study that was thought necessary to reveal the Australian government policy, because it was so totally believed that this was simply the nature of our world. Some of you may have seen the map on the screen. It started its academic life as a result of the work of Norman B. Tyndale, an anthropologist, a prolific academic who undertook studies of insect life, animal life, and also Aboriginal people. In the 20th century, he travelled to missions and reserves. And for some of you who aren't aware, they were the manifestation of those race-based policies segregating Aboriginal people from the broader Australian community. Those missions and reserves came under the administration of managers. And it was through Norman Tyndale's engagement with those managers that he was able to recruit Aboriginal people as research informants. What was never mentioned was that Aboriginal people who refused to cooperate as research participants were threatened with the withdrawal of their ration supply if they didn't cooperate with the research. The collection of tissue samples, measurements, which the participants still reported as dehumanising in terms of their being objectified by the research process, were all collected and are still stored in the South Australian Museum. They are stored there because they continue to be the subject of what I believe is unethical research into those remains. I'm sure the researchers are aware of the developments in ethical research, and I know they have approached some families of the now dead people from whom they harvested that tissue sample. Families have refused to allow their ancestors' tissue samples to be used in research. However, they are, from the point of their refusal, they are cut off from the research project and unable to retrieve their ancestors' materials. I mean, including children's drawings, which were collected by the team at all. So there still is a level of secrecy around this type of unethical research today, even though it produces such an informative picture of the jurisdiction of Aboriginal people prior to colonisation. This is a deeply concerning irony of academic research. These are the things that really have driven deep suspicion in the Aboriginal community as to the aims of academic research and exactly what is the contribution of research in Aboriginal communities to the academy generally. Of course, after the war, the attitudes about race were changing after the genocide was discovered of 6 million Jewish people. We have international standards now that talk about human rights, that frame the crime of genocide. Unfortunately, Australia, even though we might have participated in the development of these standards, we were and still are late adopters of these, what are international minimum standards agreed by governments around the world. It did result in the removal of explicit race-based provisions in Australian legislation, but again, euphemisms tended to replace that. Euphemisms like neglect, which was still used as the basis for the removal of Aboriginal children, mental illness, which could be used to construe poor behaviour as criminally penalised. It was up to the administrators of those small missions and reserves to impose carceral penalties and capital punishment on Aboriginal people. Once again, all underpinned by the belief that this was an acceptable way to treat Aboriginal people right through the majority of the 20th century up until the 1970s. in parts of Australia, in Queensland up until 1983. So the knowing of research appears total. Contrast that with the experience of the researched people. What we have seen as Aboriginal people is the tendency for academic research to create conclusions which are definitive, which serve to fuel the use of stereotypical ideas in relation to Aboriginal people, the way we live, who we are, and what expectations should be held of us as participants in broader Australian society. Aboriginal people became objectified as subjects of research, and there was no demand, if you like, on academic researchers to take into consideration any legal or political rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people as research partners. And this is still an absolute site of contention in contemporary academic research. What I have found is that there are academic researchers, even those who have years of experience, there is an absence of understanding of the context in which their research takes place. Who are their research partners? What have been the historical experiences of their research partners? And how do aspects of colonisation still inform any type of research partnership? How is a eugenics frame of reference addressed in the research partnership? These are tangible and conscious steps that need to be taken. In 1974, the Australian Institute for Aboriginal Studies, now known as IATSIS, held its 6th biennial general meeting. It had held 5 general meetings without Aboriginal people being involved at all. A group of intellectual agitators, Aboriginal people, put together a challenge to the academic researchers participating in that biennial general meeting. And they named themselves Eagle, Hawk and Crow. If you want to follow up and find out more about that history, I'd suggest you visit Professor Gary Foley's Aboriginal History Archive. It's on campus. This is the history that enriches our understanding about contemporary Australian politics. Eagle and Crow, the group, penned a letter published in the Australian Union of Students newsletter and criticised the focus on research being only for people that those researchers viewed as tribal. That research had created a view about who was an authentic Aboriginal community and who was not. Further again, dismissing the identity of Aboriginal people. This is how dispossession continues for Aboriginal people. Not only are we dispossessed of our lands, we become dispossessed of our identity through this approach to research. They also challenged the institution on its tokenised involvement of Aboriginal people in research projects. And it called on researchers to establish projects which were relevant to actual Aboriginal people at a time when Aboriginal people were dying in high numbers from preventable diseases. Infant mortality in Australia, mid-20th century, was as bad as third world nations. Research about the overrepresentation of Aboriginal people in the criminal justice system could have uncovered the reasons why this type of contact had persisted since colonisation with police agencies and the criminal justice system generally. In the mid-20th century, Aboriginal people were still regarded as informants, which played in a research paradigm that was designed to reinforce privilege of the researcher and the researcher's values and beliefs. So the challenge today is to move beyond that way of undertaking research and to engage with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities as partners. I briefly had the chance to work on the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody in the Aboriginal Research Unit in Darwin. It was the purpose of the Aboriginal Research Unit to investigate underlying issues which informed the overrepresentation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in custody. This is an interesting example of how research could be forced to undertake a broader perspective to look at the issues that contribute to a particular statistic rather than simply focusing on the statistics of death in custody alone. The report of the Aboriginal Issues Unit revealed how the actions of governments since colonisation had contributed to the disempowerment of Aboriginal people, and how the eugenics frame had relegated Aboriginal people to a part of Australian society that wasn't seen to be deserving of equality. The nature of engagement between the police force and Aboriginal communities was to assert an over-regulation on the Aboriginal community because these state-based laws focused on every aspect of Aboriginal people's lives. Even being in a township after curfew hours could attract public punishment, or it could result in your removal from that community. These were the real outcomes for Aboriginal people as a result of the actions that were authorised by governments. Because of the challenge that Aboriginal people made to the Royal Commission, these issues became part of the research. The Human Rights Commission in the 1990s responded to the Northern Territory stolen generations, mounting a High Court case seeking compensation for their removal. The government in its dying days, the Keating government called for an inquiry to be run by Ronald Wilson and the Australian Human Rights Commission to look into those state-based laws that administered the separation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children from their families. This process travelled all over Australia, gathering evidence from Aboriginal people. In the Northern Territory, we campaigned tirelessly. We agitated for people to be provided the support that was necessary for them to give evidence about trauma that they may not have spoken about ever since experiencing it during their removal as children. This type of research could in itself create harm and loss for the Aboriginal people brave enough to give this evidence. Participating in these public inquiries, contributing to a broader understanding about the issues affecting Aboriginal communities doesn't always result in change. So the support to Aboriginal people for having to tell their story, often on more than one occasion, to prove, if you like, the harmful experiences that impact their lives today and the lives of their family. These can be the costs of being involved in these research projects. These costs are real. We saw in the late 1990s a political backlash to the idea of the existence of frontier violence. We saw the leadership of the Howard government in refusing to allow public discussion of frontier conflict. There were many non-Aboriginal academics who were called on to prove their research, whose research was drawn into question as to the veracity of the testimony by Aboriginal people to the existence of colonial conflict. In fact, in that debate, there was an absence completely of Aboriginal people who were engaged to talk about the truth of colonisation. So we're talking about 25 years ago now, at a point where the veracity of the Aboriginal voice wasn't seen to be a legitimate contribution in what was termed the culture wars or the history wars. It's only in the immediate recent past that there now has been actual legitimacy given to Aboriginal people to participate in these debates. People like the author Alexis Wright. For those of you interested to understand more about our response to the silence that Aboriginal people feel, you can read in a past publication of Meanjin, what happens when you tell someone else's story. Until we as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are able to contribute to the national narrative and the overarching discourse, how can there be a proper understanding of who we are as a people and what has happened to us in Australia? This is the challenge of our society, but in particular in academic research. So you might be able to gain some insight into my perspectives about academic research, about academic publications, and about my caution as an Aboriginal person now seeking to interrogate the circumstances for my homeland in Kakadu. In the late 1990s, a uranium mine was already operating in Kakadu National Park. It had been there for 20 years. Aboriginal people were provided income, the equivalent of royalty income, and it had not largely improved their lives. They lived under roofing iron on concrete blocks. They didn't have access to services in the township of Jabiluka, the township which was built to service the needs of the mining community at the local uranium mine. Traditional owners who were supposedly the beneficiary of this uranium mining agreement found themselves to be fringe dwellers in a governance sense as well as a physical sense. Their participation in decisions about what happened on their land, how the township of Jabiluka was managed, how the mining took place, given that there were spills, accidents and containment at the uranium mine, contamination. All these issues Aboriginal people experienced powerlessness on. And when the new proposal at the election of the Howard government was made to move ahead with a new development on the lease adjacent to the existing uranium mine, traditional owners were prepared to campaign against it. Even though the Northern Land Council had signed an agreement on their behalf 20 years before, they were not going to agree that a mine should go ahead, given the circumstances in their community and their experience living adjacent to a uranium mine for 20 years. It had no benefit for Aboriginal people in the region. It simply allowed an industrial complex to operate for which they had no ability to intervene, in spite of them holding inalienable freehold title. How was a group of 30 traditional owners, the majority of them women, how were they going to prevent this actual and real threat to their future from going ahead? We had no idea that we would be able to create the political circumstances that would stop the uranium mine, but we were absolutely convinced in the power and authority that we have as Aboriginal people to control our destiny. And we travelled all over the world to tell our story, and we took whatever legal action or jurisdictional intervention we could take to prevent the mine going ahead. So for my research now, going back, the focus of my research is not on the experience of Aboriginal people. I want my research to reveal the efforts that Australian governments will make at the territory level and at the federal level to suppress Aboriginal participation in decisions about their land, because effectively the Australian government spent millions to try to counter our campaign to stop Jabiluka. So my research, I am looking to engage research participants generally who are not Aboriginal, but they were not part of supporting the views or the beliefs or the rights of Aboriginal people from Kakadu at the time. So this presents an ethical conundrum, because they're entitled to participate in overriding the views of Aboriginal people, but they may not want to really revisit their participation in suppressing the rights of Aboriginal people. So there are also organisations that operate in an Aboriginal jurisdiction, like the Northern Land Council, who are challenged by the steps taken by traditional owners to prevent mining going ahead. This is antithetical to the operation of an organisation that signs agreements for mining. What does this all mean, and how ethically can those research participants be protected during this research process? So these are the issues which have arisen as a result of the research that I'm doing in relation to the campaign. I, in applying for my research ethics approval, configured a research committee, an ethics committee of my own, which I can seek support from and guidance during the course of my PhD. And that really has gone a long way to ensuring that I have the capacity to address ethical issues as they arise during my PhD process. I've talked too long, but I just wanted to go over the IATSIS Code of Ethics as well, for those of you who may not be familiar. It's available at the IATSIS website, and it reveals the principles that generally are advisable during any research with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. So these are the 4 principles. The IATSIS Code is not the final solution. It's not the be-all and end-all. I don't think there are any processes which answer every question. But what it can do is help you on your journey if you are participating in research in this space. It hopefully breaks down the aims and research design that you might be thinking of when you engage with the Aboriginal community, and it gives the big headings that hopefully you will take time to work through in your research design and research partnership. I think it's a very important point that engagement is different from consultation. I think people don't often take into account the different perspectives that are held by Aboriginal people about academic research, and there really do have to be common expectations that are well understood in detail. In some communities, there can be research which is undertaken that really does have a legal ramification for Aboriginal people. I've sat in on some negotiations where Aboriginal people's native title is really what is being revealed during the proposed research. Aboriginal people haven't been able to attract the necessary advice to protect their interests. So, for example, when a chemistry department wants to partner with Aboriginal people in finding Aboriginal bush tucker so that they might be able to reproduce the various chemicals that might be of benefit, they're using Aboriginal knowledge to gain access to that chemical. These are tangible rights that Aboriginal people have. So it's very important to be aware of the rights and interests that Aboriginal people hold in these research partnerships, and they can be defined in your benefit sharing agreements. But there must be an exchange for the knowledge and participation of Aboriginal people in these research projects. Consider too that research projects that want to examine issues around identity of Aboriginal people step immediately into the historical experience of the families of those people who may participate in the research. Looking at the individual's experiences isn't enough in academic research participation for Aboriginal people. The experience of disempowerment by Aboriginal people will emerge at some point in academic research, and this must be well anticipated. That's part of sustainability in research. That's what we mean when we talk about sustainability and accountability as well. So that in reviewing your research at any point in the research paradigm, you have the chance to reflect on the things that are working and the challenges that have emerged. So, just my brief conclusions. Thank you so much for listening to me go over time. I'm so sorry. Please, I'm happy to field any questions, but I hope that's in some way been illuminating to those people who are participating in or intend to create research partnerships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities.
Thank you, Jacqui. That was an amazing presentation. You have contributed heaps tons of knowledge about ethical and historical ethical research that's usually silenced in ethical discussions. You have beautifully given all of us, all of those also very practical considerations to do whilst conducting ethical research. And also you have changed the lens of what we think of Indigenous research, and also looking back at what's the oppression, what's the colonization that's ongoing. So thank you very much for all of that.
Thank you, Angela.
We know that we've gone a little bit over time, but
sorry.
No, not at all. It was very interesting. So whoever wants to stick around to keep engaged in the conversation, feel free to do so. I think, does anyone have a question? I think, Deborah, you have your hand up.
Yes, Jacqui, thank you so much for your wonderful talk. I appreciate it very much. So I just have one comment. I wonder, and then I have a question. I wonder if you're familiar with the work of Margaret Urban Walker about reparations and the Lakota Sioux people and the Blackfoot Mountains. If not, I'd be very happy to send you the reference, because it does speak to a lot of things you're talking about. But my question really as the chair is that, you know, this is something that we wrangle with a lot in terms of review, and I think many of us are not, we're very reflective of our own practice on the committee, and what we would love is to hear is what you think we could be doing better in terms of review. We're doing it with open hearts and open ears. So
Yes.
if you have any, and I was very interested in your practice about having your own ethical committee. So anything
Yes.
will be very, very
Yes.
welcome.
Yes, look, I suffered a bit from researchers' cringe, let's say. Of course, I'm going to be the best researcher. Of course, I'm never going to do anything that might, you know, create distress with the people that I'm working with. But it's important to come to that realisation. And I'm glad that I did that from a personal perspective. Because there are issues that sometimes I am going to be too close to the subject matter to be able to provide a critical analysis on. I mean, my research is about the things that I did as well as an Aboriginal person. And I have to be able to critically reflect on that and the relationship that I had with effectively members of my family. We were working in a formal organisational context. And my concern at the time was that I should be ethical in the advice that I was giving to my family as well. Look, other universities have struggled with this, but engaging in an Indigenous perspective officially at the level of ethics committees is a valuable process. It's a partnership that has a beginning and a middle, and it's ongoing. There has to be some opportunity for Aboriginal people to be heard and for those concerns to be taken on board. I mean, my experience with the University of Technology, Sydney, is that the Jumbana Centre has its own ethical contact who participates in an Indigenous ethics committee. So it's not just drawn from people who are employed by the university. Its membership is drawn from other people in the field who can contribute or share ways of enriching the research participation. And it really needs to be discussed on those terms, I think, so that there can be an open process of learning.
Yep.
I think this is critical.
Thank you.
Thanks.
That's very useful. Thank you.
Thank you for the question, Deborah. Does anybody else have a question? Mary, go ahead.
Jacqui, I'm not Indigenous and my research is looking at health in the Indigenous space. My confirmation panel wanted me to tell the story of the group I'm researching with to provide historical context. I don't believe that story is mine to tell. I'm wondering what you think about that.
I can see the issue that you're raising, Mary, and it's important to point out that, yes, to have a true representation of the historical experience, getting Aboriginal people to do those things are important because it sets a picture which reflects the experience that Aboriginal people have had, an experience which you would hope the research process would then empower them by. As well, in partnership, it's important for non-Indigenous researchers to be able to articulate your perspective about those issues that have affected Aboriginal people. This is a way of us all developing a common understanding or a more informed approach.
If I could write it as a dialogue between myself and a representative from the community, that
absolutely.
might be.
Yes, and knowing the history of that particular issue in your community can be so much more enriching for the research experience, just to, you know, in terms of health, the ethics of health research has been a subject of interest and scrutiny for the Aboriginal community, especially here in Victoria, since the 1960s, and it resulted in the establishment of Aboriginal health organisations that implement community control as the means to achieve well-being in a total sense in the community, and understanding the approach that your local community has to those ideas about health and the steps that people have taken offers, you know, so much to learn from for everybody. But you're lucky because you're in the Victorian community where so much work has been done on it. That's great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mary. I think we have time for one more question.
Angela, I don't have a question, but Jacqui, I'm so glad that we bumped into each other. So those incidental sorts of bumpings up, I guess, just opens up the importance of the conversations that we can have. I want to thank you for taking up this opportunity, because I think that we have, as you pointed out, one of the most amazing resources at Victoria University in Moondani Balluk and the Aboriginal History Archive. And we have all of you there. So I implore people to engage with these spaces, and also to engage with the scholars there, because there is so much to learn. And I think the sorts of challenge that we have requires the sorts of conversations. But I think the deep issues that you raised about the history of coloniality of research and its continuity, current practices, is, when we do research, we need to look into those sorts of things, because guidelines by themselves do not ask the questions that sits deeply in terms of the assumptions that we've inherited over time. So I think it's amazing, and I think it's the guidelines that you said at the end, they are guidelines, but they still ask us to ask questions about our practice. And so thank you for doing that, because I think I can just reiterate, please have a look at the amazing resources. And Moondani Balluk has been putting up all sorts of things around the place that tells about history, local history, and so forth. So there's a great space to learn together.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Angela.
Thank you.
Thanks,
and again,
Roshani and Angela.
no worries.